One of the things that interests me about gamification is the fact that we spend a lot of our time holding people's hands and telling them they're wonderful and congratulating them for everything they do, and very little of our time saying, yeah, you failed, you need to try again. And the reason is that gamification has grown up with this mindset of millennials are different. We're focusing on millennials because they need to have their hands held, they need to be allowed to ask why, they need to be cuddled and kept care of, which is absolute nonsense because millennials are no different to the rest of us. It's nothing to do with growing up around video games, it's everything to do with growing up in an environment where they can ask questions. When I was a kid, you didn't ask questions at school, unless you were asked to ask questions. You just sat there quietly and you did what you were told because you almost lived in fear of teachers. And that's changed now. There's a lot more control of what teachers can and can't do in schools. So kids grow up asking questions. They ask why. They constantly question the system, which is why a lot of political parties are having problems now and seeing that just going away and doing whatever you want doesn't sit well with the people anymore. And this is great, and this is brilliant. But in gamification, we have to accept that we need to also tell people when they've got something wrong, and we have to explain why it was wrong. And this came to mind originally because the project I was working on, they needed to impress upon students that failure wasn't okay, repeated failure was bad. Not learning from your mistakes was going to cause real problems in real life. So the system, had you losing lives and had you being sort of told by the system to improve, get better, learn stuff. But every time you failed, you were given a point on how to learn and improve. And it was only when you'd failed to learn several times that it took you back to the beginning and said, no, start again. You got to try again. We need you to learn this. So failure is absolutely fine. I tell my kids quite often that you shouldn't fear failing at all. What you should fear is not learning from failure, because if you don't learn from your failures, then you're going to repeat them over and over again. Something else that a lot of political parties are finding now, that they just don't seem to learn from their failures and just keep repeating the mistakes of history. But I digress. The other thing that sort of came to mind with this was someone talking to me about a loyalty scheme they were on, which had punished them for not using the scheme enough. They'd been levelled down for not buying video games on a regular enough basis. And it brought into mind something I'd had with British Airways, because I didn't fly often enough with them, so I lost my status with them, I lost my tier points. And it happens, it's sort of a regular thing, you lose them at the end of the year if you haven't used them, blah, blah. And what it didn't take into account was my circumstances. What in their mind is, in the corporate mind is, that we are going to tell you if you don't use us, you're going to lose us. And I can understand that, I can see that, I understand the thinking behind that. But the problem is that kind of thing doesn't teach me anything other than the fact that they don't really understand what they're talking about when it comes to consumer behaviour and loyalty. Because what happens is, you're levelled down because of personal circumstances. In my case, I lost my job. And I wasn't flying anymore because I wasn't flying to the office. I'd moved on somewhere else. So the last thing I was interested in was trying to get on flights to improve my points value. In the case of this other person, like I said, they just didn't buy enough video games. But the company wasn't interested in why. They had no investment in the people who they're trying to make loyal to them. Their only investment was to themselves. And this was a real problem. And all it does is it breeds a lack of loyalty, because as soon as that happens, you just think, do you know what? All I've learned here is that you're an arsehole and that I don't want to use you anymore. So failure is fine. Punishing failure is fine, as long as you allow the person who has failed to learn from their mistakes. And the only way to make them learn from their mistakes is to keep them informed and to keep the punishment in line with the failure. Now, failure of personal circumstances to go and buy video games shouldn't result in my status within that company being reduced. You shouldn't lose kudos just because, for whatever reason, you are unable to use the system. It's not quite the same as revisiting a forum regularly and then saying, oh, if you don't revisit us, you've been away for a really long time, you might lose a bit of kudos, because there's no money invested in that. If I've actually invested money and have got points and loyalty points from buying things from a shop, I don't then expect to lose them because I've not been able to use them. I'm sure there are people out there who've got different ideas on this and different thoughts on this, but I can't imagine any of them would argue with these things. Failure is fine as long as you learn from failure, And a system that punishes failure is fine as long as it gives people the ability to learn from that failure. So hopefully you've learned from this. Cheers.